and thank you everyone for joining. Um, we're going to talk about daily fantasy sports today. It's definitely a topic that has been emerging for a number of years, and with a recent legislation here in Ohio, kind of reemerged as something that the Problem Gambling Network of Ohio thought we should discuss. So I'm going to take a stab at it, and we have Amanda Blackford from the Ohio Casino Control Commission to add some points throughout the webinar, and especially when we get a little more to the legal side. We'll kind of jump right in. You can use your controls to ask questions, raise hands throughout the webinar, and I think that's fine if we ask questions throughout, just because it's kind of at times can be an unfamiliar or confusing topic. So I think if you have questions that we want to answer during is better than waiting until the end. But we definitely did set aside some time to answer questions, have some discussion at the end as well. So feel free to do either. And just think about during the webinar if there's any information or lessons you want to leave with today. Again, this is a new topic for a lot of people, so just jot down some things you want to get out of today, and if we don't cover it, we'll try to discuss it at the end. I do have a trigger warning because some slides, images, and information could present as a trigger to those in recovery. Some of the information we're going to talk about and see, I am going to go to a fantasy sports site to describe and show how you pick players and change players and things of that nature. So we will be on a fantasy sports website for a little bit of today. So if there's things that you think may present as a trigger, feel free to step away from the webinar, and we can always make the information on this webinar trigger free and pass it on to you if you feel like you want some of that information. Our objectives today, we're going to describe what daily fantasy sports are and their progression and evolution of the contests over time. They've certainly changed drastically over time, so we're going to talk about that. Discuss the legality of daily fantasy sports in Ohio and nationally. Discuss the relevance to traditional sports wagering and some potential implications for future gambling expansion. So some of the popularity of fantasy sports is having an impact on how we view traditional sports betting and what could come down the pike. And we're going to discuss the consumer protections that are being put in place to hopefully prevent or diminish some of the problem gambling correlations related to daily fantasy sports here in Ohio. And I think we do have a good amount that we're trying to put in place to have some protection for the people who choose to play these contests. So we live in a gambling culture, which I think a lot of people are aware of. Gambling is no longer compartmentalized. We don't have to go too far back into history to when we only gambled in certain places, namely Atlantic City in New Jersey and Las Vegas in Nevada. Over time, that has changed. We don't have to go too far back into history where only certain types of people gambled. These people may have been risky or immoral. They were, didn't think through their decisions. It was something that not a lot of people did, that was kind of almost looked down upon. And people gambled at certain times, whether it was when they were traveling, because again, you did have to travel to gamble, whether it was holidays, vacations. So that has certainly changed. We have a decompartmentalization of gambling. We can gamble at any time, all types of people gamble, and we can gamble pretty much anywhere. I think a lot of this comes from an increase in what I call the 3 A's. So we have an increase in availability. We have multiple legal forms in this state. We have casino style gambling. So we have table games like poker and blackjack. We have machine gaming like slot machines. We have lottery. We have bingos. We have horse racing tracks. So we have multiple legal forms in this state. We also have a popularity and normalization of illegal forms. So when we think about things like sports gambling, fantasy sports has certainly been on the fence for the past couple of years, but even traditional sports wagering is illegal in the state, yet a very normalized and popular thing. And you can even see that on certain television shows, sports shows that discuss sports gambling regularly with just reporting general statistics. And accessibility. So there's 48 states in this country that have some form of legalized gambling. And I believe we're actually up to 40 states now that have casinos, whether those are commercial casinos or tribal casinos. So again, a big increase in accessibility. And with that expansion also comes technology. So not to be cliche, but we literally have gambling at our fingertips because of our mobile devices. So we can do anything from sports betting to fantasy sports betting to playing casino type games like slot machines or poker on our mobile devices. And even new legislation just in our neighboring state of PA has iLottery, so being able to purchase lottery tickets or play the lottery on your phone. So technology has had a big impact on the accessibility of gambling. And then acceptability. So this is something that's certainly acceptable in our culture. Not to say that it shouldn't be, but religious groups, charities, fundraisers all use gambling as a way to create funds, whether it's track nights or casino nights, bingo, 50-50 raffles. Schools, religious groups all use this as a way to create funds. So it's become a very normalized part of our culture. Here's casino gambling in 2013. Once all these sites were up. So Ohio is a gambling state. I don't think, maybe if you don't live in Ohio, it's certainly not considered something like Nevada, but we have a number of venues spread all throughout our state for people to gamble. So we have the 4 gray stars of the casinos in Cleveland, Columbus, Toledo, and Cincinnati. Then we have these red diamonds, which are our racinos, which are the horse racing tracks that have video lottery terminals, which are essentially slot machines. So we have 11 what we call casino style venues in this state. And just a couple of years ago, we didn't have any of these. So a big boon lately that has really made Ohio a gambling state. Because of that, I thought I'd show some new Ohio data that came out in 2016. Greater than 10%, it's 10.3% of Ohio adults aged 18 and older have some level of risk for problem gambling. So you can see 571,000 are at low risk, 271,000 are at moderate risk, and then we have 76,000 Ohio adults that are at high risk or are probable problem gamblers. So that's almost a little less than 1 million Ohio adults are at some level of risk for problem gambling, and that number is more than doubled since 2012. So this was a replication study that was done by Ohio Mental Health and Addiction Services. They did it before the casinos opened in 2012, and we redid it. And so those numbers of individuals at risk for problem gambling have more than doubled in the past 5 years. So certainly something that is normal, that does follow the trends of states who have expanded gambling. But still, even though that's normal, I think a little under 1 million people with a higher or with some level of risk for problem gambling isn't something that we want to keep normal. So continuing the prevention treatment efforts. And then you can visit that toolkit at beforeyoubet.org. So that's the state-sponsored campaign for problem gambling prevention. And that website has a lot of great information, but that toolkit on the website has a lot of great resources for you to look into. So I would visit that when you have some free time. And lastly, for the slide on our gambling culture, a lot of gambling, problem gambling co-occurrence and comorbidity issues for the individuals that do live with problem gambling. So 73% also have an alcohol use disorder, 61% personality disorder, 60% nicotine dependency, 50% have some form of a mood disorder, 41% anxiety disorder, 38% drug use, and then 20% suicide attempt rate. So 1 in 5 or 20% of disordered gamblers will attempt suicide. So that's a very high number. It's the highest suicide rate of any addiction. So just showing that this is something that it affects a lot of people, but the comorbidity is an important thing. So getting into fantasy sports, how I wanted to set this up was to briefly discuss traditional fantasy sports, because that does have an impact on the way we look at daily fantasy sports. So these things are similar, but really the way they're played, and I think the risk that they pose to potential problem gamblers is very different. Traditional fantasy sports and daily fantasy sports are really a different animal. So we want to start at the beginning of traditional fantasy sports before we get into what daily fantasy sports are. So the history, you might be surprised by this, but fantasy sports really started in the 1960s in Oakland, California, and they started with football and baseball. And the 70s and 80s steadily developed the procedures, the rules, the contests similarly to what they look like today. And in 1989, there were 1 million fantasy sports players across the country. So that number may be shocking to some people. When I really started looking into it, that was shocking to me that there were that many fantasy sports players back in 1989. In the 90s, the popularity of fantasy sports skyrockets because of home computers and internet use. So before this time, playing fantasy sports based on real player statistics was done with a pad and paper. And you had to wait till the end of the game and follow the statistics, or you even had to wait till the next morning when stats were reported in the newspaper and you collected your score with pad and paper, right? So availability of home computers, internet use, made that a lot easier. So that was a big skyrocket for fantasy sports. And in the early 2000s, you have 12 million online fantasy sports players. In 2006, the UIGEA, which is the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act, this was a law to minimize online poker, and we're going to talk about that. It's very important for daily fantasy sports. We're going to talk about that a little later, but briefly what it did is it considered fantasy sports as skill-based and not chance-based, which exempted them from this law illegalizing online poker. And this was the fantasy sports explosion. This is what created essentially daily fantasy sports. So fantasy competitions being considered skill-based and not chance-based, and kind of exempting them from other online gambling laws created daily fantasy sports. So in 2009, FanDuel was founded, and then 2011, DraftKings was founded, and these are the two big daily fantasy sports operators. In 2013, you have 21 million online fantasy sports players. And then in 2014 is when we really start getting the normalization of this. So even though there's been millions of players, we really start getting the normalcy of daily fantasy sports, and shows like SportsCenter on ESPN and other news sports shows start discussing fantasy sports with their real sports coverage. So that really has an impact on the popularity and the normalcy of it, and starting to affect live games. So while anchors are covering real sports, they're discussing the fantasy relevance of the players. So that really creates the normalcy there. And then you have 54 million online fantasy players in 2015. And this was really the peak of daily fantasy sports, when you were seeing commercials every 90 seconds and just being completely inundated with it. And then in 16 and 17, multiple states start creating legislation or pass daily fantasy sports bills, and you have 58 million players. So something that's really grown very quickly. So what is season-long fantasy football? I'm going to use football as our example just because it's typically the most popular. Speaking of daily fantasy sports, many different sports are offered, but daily fantasy football is the most popular. So I'm just going to use that as our example throughout the webinar. So in a season-long traditional fantasy football league, a group of bettors, if you will, we're going to use that word, draft or pick players one at a time. An individual player can only be drafted once or belong to one team. The bettor owns these players for the entire season. And each player receives fake points based on real individual performance. So if I draft a quarterback, how he plays in real life gives me fake points that I total for my betting. Each week, the winner is decided by most total points in a head-to-head game. So just like in real life, two teams play each other. So two teams, I might play this friend this week and then another friend the next week. Whoever receives the most total fake points wins that game. And then the winner of the season-long league is won by the bettor with the best record of wins and losses. So just like in real life. Season-long fantasy football typically has modest entry fees, which create modest pots. So a fantasy football league that I've been in had a buy-in of $30. But it also lasted the season, which is about 4 or 5 months. So you may lose $30. The winner with the best record of wins and losses wins about $250, right? So when you think about gambling in large scale, those are pretty modest fees and modest payouts. So I'm going to click over to and show you an actual fantasy football league. So this is something I created. But did not play in specifically to show how it works. But also what's really interesting about this is that I didn't play. I picked these players but didn't play, but still won 3 games. Now I lost 11 in a 14-week league. But I think that shows, yes, it's skill-based, but there's also an element of chance, right? I think some people mistakenly view any sports gambling, but also daily fantasy sports or season-long fantasy sports as all skill-based, all knowledge-based. But clearly there's an element of chance because we aren't these players. So I still won 3 games, even though I didn't actually play. But so this is how it works. I drafted all of these players. So in this league, no one else had these players. You have your roster here that you play each week, and BN stands for bench. So I own these players, but they didn't play in this particular week, which I'm showing you week 3. So Russell Wilson, based on his actual performance in the game, scored me 33 points, which is a good day. Someone like Dez Bryant, who's a wide receiver, WR, scored 9 points. Now, I could have played this player right here, Michael Thomas, who's also a wide receiver. He was on my bench, so I didn't play him, but I own him, scored 21 points. So maybe the next week I would have wanted to take Dez Bryant out and put Michael Thomas in. That's how this works. So I own these players for the entire season, but each week I can use different players based on their performance. Now, that's not to say that he might not have a really great week. So that's where the looking into the statistics and who plays well, et cetera, comes into play. But of course, there's still chance because I might know all these different algorithms and whatnot, but that really doesn't have an effect on the actual performance. So why I wanted to show this is because this is season long. So I own these players the entire year and I can swap them out. No other player in this league has these players. And that's going to have a big impact on when we're describing daily fantasy. So daily fantasy sports. The evolution is a combination of 3 things: traditional sports betting, traditional fantasy sports, and then online poker. The payout systems kind of replicate online poker payout structures similarly. So a lot of online poker players went to or moved to fantasy sports. It's also an outcome of the illegality of traditional sports betting. So we're going to talk about the law that made traditional sports betting illegal, which brought people to fantasy sports. It's also an outcome of the disinterest and the commitment of traditional fantasy sports. So again, I showed you I owned those players the entire year, so I don't get to change if players get injured, etc. I'm kind of stuck with them. So the commitment is long. Again, saying something like putting in $30 and not being able to know if you win or lose for a couple months becomes a disinterest. So people want to play more often. And then the crackdown on illegal internet poker, which we're going to talk about. So all these things kind of help really blossom daily fantasy sports. The progression, again, traditional is season long. There's preset leagues, so I know the people I'm playing with, whether this is friends, cousins, coworkers, I know the people I'm playing with. And again, casual winning pots. Daily fantasy sports is daily. It's exactly what it is. So my players are changing every day. The buy-ins and payouts are daily, so I'm not waiting the whole season. I could be playing anyone and anywhere, so I don't know the people I'm playing, and thousands, if not millions, are up for grabs. Something else that's kind of silly, but I wanted to show, typically in these traditional daily fantasy sports leagues, the casual pots also come with a loss. So the loser of the league typically had to do something kind of embarrassing. Why this is important, why I'm showing this is because it shows the casualness of traditional fantasy sports. You have casual pots, but also this kind of just like stunt shows the casualness of it. Now, something like this wouldn't happen with a daily league because it's so, right, there's millions up for grabs. This isn't something that's casual. This isn't something that's kind of just fun to do. This is something that's taken very seriously amongst the players who play in these daily fantasy leagues. So the big two, again, you've probably heard these names, DraftKings and FanDuel. These are the two biggest daily fantasy sports operators. They each bring in over $1 billion annually. We do have some other ones, and there's many, but here's some of the smaller and known operators: CBS Sports, Fantasy Draft, etc. To give a look at really what these two big operators bring in, the sports books. So the sports books in Las Vegas in the first week of the NFL season brought in about $30 million in bets, and DraftKings and FanDuel combined in the first week of the NFL season to bring in about $60 million. So DraftKings and FanDuel are doubling what the legal sports books in Las Vegas are bringing in, at least for that first week of the NFL season. So that's really showing the popularity, but also the amount of wagering that's going on these sites. So daily fantasy football, if we look back to what I was showing with traditional fantasy football, I pick players that no one else can own, and I own them for the season, and I swap them out based on their play. Daily fantasy sports is a little different. I pick individual players based on a fake salary cap set by the site. So an example, I may be given $1 million fake dollars. Now each player is assigned a fake monetary value based on their skill. And users or bettors construct a roster of players that fall under the salary cap. So good players cost more and worse players cost less. So if I want to buy a really, really good player, he's going to play well for me, yeah, but then I can only fill out my roster with lesser skilled players. So you kind of want to balance that with a lot of mediocre players. Do you want to take a risk on having one really good player with other bad players, or do you want to try to make a roster full of medium skilled players and see how they play? So that's kind of really where the statistics and the algorithms come from that the guys are who play these contests. And players can be selected by multiple bettors, so that's one of the other big differences. In the traditional leagues, a player can only belong to one team. Multiple people can own multiple players. And then like the traditional fantasy sports, the player receives fake points based on their individual performance. The winner is decided by most total points, but pots can be split among multiple bettors. So again, kind of the daily fantasy sports goal is performance over market value. So I want to look for medium skilled players who are low cost for me to buy, but perform at a really high level, increasing my chance of winning. Now this is blinking over here. I'm sorry that I had Do we have any questions? Doesn't look like it. Okay.
We don't have any questions at this time, but if you do have a question, feel free to ask it in the question sections of your GoToWebinar navigation panel.
Thank you, Derek. Yeah, I just saw that one blinking, but I think that notification was just that we had started. So I was a little behind that one, but yeah, ask a question anytime. So now this is kind of convoluted, right? And I'm trying to boil it down as simple as possible, but I think that still shows, right? This is something that's convoluted. It can be confusing. So it really is, it's something that does take knowledge to understand all of this and play it at a high level. Let's see, I'm not clicking forward right now for some reason. There we go. Some more differences between traditional and daily fantasy sports. Again, the duration. I'm not drafting a team for an entire season. I'm picking players for just one day or for a single week, like in the NFL. So the NFL has football games on Thursdays, Sundays, and Mondays. So I own these players for a couple days, but then the next week I can pick different ones. The player pool. So traditional fantasy football, I'm probably playing with friends or coworkers. Small pots, around a dozen people or so. And again, those small wagers, but I could be playing in daily fantasy football. I could be playing thousands of people, and then for a lot of money. And competition awareness. Who am I actually playing? So we have this idea of sharks and minnows, really good players and the less experienced players. I know in my league who studies up, who knows a lot more, who pays more attention, et cetera, et cetera. In the daily leagues, I might not know who I'm playing. So I might be playing really, really good, really experienced players, and that's certainly going to decrease my chances of winning. So it's kind of walking into these bets blindly. The reality of daily fantasy sports. Ads show that anyone can win and any casual fan can play. Now, certainly anybody can play, and anybody can get lucky. You saw when I was showing my league that I didn't even really participate, but still won 3 games to show that there's still chance involved. But the reality is 1.3% of players win 91% of the prize money. And 75 to 85% of players actually lose money. I'm going to read this quote from the Sports Business Journal. For DraftKings and FanDuel to keep profits at more than $1 billion requires a continuous stream of new players lured by ever-increasing prize pools with the help of muscular advertising campaigns. These ads never spell out the simple truth about daily fantasy competitions. While any player might get lucky on the back of a handful of entries, over time nearly all of the prize money flows to the tiny elite, equipped with elaborate statistical modeling and automated tools that can manage hundreds of entries at once and identify the weakest opponents. And that's really important because that's what happens. So we have your average Joe sports fan can play and can get lucky and win some money. But what he is winning is typically a modest sum. So when you're seeing people or hearing about people who are winning millions of dollars, these are statistical geniuses, to be quite frankly. They use computer algorithms, these statistical models to pick the right player at the right time. Again, what I was talking about earlier, they're picking these low-cost players who are going to unknowingly perform at a high level. And to give the player breakdown, the top 100 ranked players in the world are considered whales, and they combined for 330 winning lineups per day. So each player is winning about 3 times per day. The Sharks are the top 10 ranked players, and they combine for 873 winning lineups per day, which is about 87 wins per day per player. And this is from one research on one league. So the other 20,000 players in this particular contest, combined for 13 winning lineups per day. So that's a 0.00065% chance of winning one time. So that alludes to that statistic of 1.3 of the players win 91% of the money. The prize pools in these daily fantasy contests, they can vary widely in terms of how much they cost to enter and how they're structured. So a contest can cost anywhere from 25 cents all the way up to $10,000. Most of these contests that your average player is going to do are about $25 to $50 to enter. I see that we have a chat. Derek, does it look like I was getting a notification? Do I have a question? Yeah. Great question. Are there DFS or daily fantasy sports contests around college sports? There are, not in every state, and we will get to that. In a couple slides, we're going to talk about that. That was a great question. And I think that's really important because of when you think about things like amateur status and potentially fixing games. The quick answer is it depends on what state you're in. So back to the prize pools. Your typical prize entry, or your typical entry fee, $25 to $50, but there can be very, very small ones and very, very large ones. There are a couple different types of pools that you can enter in. These guaranteed prize pools, players pay a set entry fee to compete for a share of the fixed prize pool. So the winning pot is already decided. So it does not matter how many people enter. The winning pot is already decided, and some of the best entries or the best teams made up of the players win the money. Cash games. Cash games, you can join a league or create your own in which the best performing team wins the money. So there can be multiple winners in this. There'd only be one winner in this game, in this cash game. Similar to the head-to-head, there'd only be one winner, but there's only two people playing. So for instance, me and Derek could create a fantasy team and play head-to-head, and whoever wins would take the whole pot. Here, whoever wins can take the whole pot, but there can be a number of entrants. And then the 50-50 games that some people like to play, there can be any number of entrants who want to play, and the top half of the players double their money, where the bottom half lose their money. So there's, again, right, convoluted. There's a number of different contests. You don't necessarily know who you're playing. So it's a pretty wild thing. What sports are offered? The major North American team sports are the most popular for daily fantasy sports: football, basketball, baseball, and hockey. Some sites, such as DraftKings, offer other sports as well. So you can play fantasy golf, NASCAR, soccer, even mixed martial arts and esports. DraftKings and FanDuel, to the comment we had, DraftKings and FanDuel reached an agreement with the NCAA to stop offering contests based on college events, although other operators still offer them. So the big two don't offer college sports, but the smaller operators can and do offer college sports. Regulations cropping up in some states ban amateur fantasy sports. And you can see down there that Ohio, now that daily fantasy sports is legal in Ohio, we will not be offering any fantasy sports based on high school, college, or other amateur sports, which is a good thing, because going to the possibility of fixing games is something that it's different with traditional sports wagering and fantasy. Because if you think about, and I don't want to go off on a big tangent here, but if you want to fix a game for traditional sports betting, you have to get a lot of people bought in on that on a certain team. When you're talking about fantasy sports, remember, we're just picking a player. We're not betting on teams. We're betting on individual player statistics. So if I were someone who wanted to fix sports gambling, I only need to get one of the players involved in that. So having fantasy sports with college sports is something that I would be against, and I'm glad that a lot of states are not offering that, and I'm glad that the big two, DraftKings and FanDuel, have stopped doing that as well to keep this as clean as possible, I suppose. Another thing that's interesting is that forever and ever, baseball and football have been the two most popular fantasy sports that people bet on, but basketball is really emerging now as the one that's the most, I don't want to say the most popular. I think football is still the most popular, but basketball is really emerging as one that's being bet on a lot more and could overtake football. And that's simply because basketball games are every night. During the basketball season, there's an NBA game on every night. So if I'm a daily fantasy basketball player, I can make bets and I can play every single night. Daily fantasy football, again, there's only games in the NFL Thursday, Sunday, and Monday, so I can't play every day. So basketball is really emerging now as something that's growing because of the constant availability of it. So legality. I'm going to talk about a couple laws here that really helped spawn the growth of daily fantasy sports. PASPA, or the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act of '92, was the federal law that effectively banned sports betting across the nation. Specific language allowed for states with at least 10 years in legally licensed gaming the opportunity to apply for immunity to this law. That's why some states do have legalized sports betting. Interestingly, New Jersey did not act on this immunity, even though they had 11 casinos in Atlantic City. And that's something that's becoming very, very relevant now with New Jersey trying to repeal this law. And we'll talk about that briefly towards the end of this webinar. So illegalizing traditional sports betting helped grow fantasy sports betting. Then we have this law, which we have touched on briefly, the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act of 2006. This made it illegal for banks and credit card companies to allow money to be transferred to online casinos or gambling websites. Now, this sharply reduced U.S. play on internet gambling sites, mainly poker sites, mainly Texas Hold'em poker sites. So you have a crackdown on traditional sports betting in '92, and then you have this crackdown on online casinos in 2006. Because of certain language, this unintentionally spawned the growth of daily fantasy sports. Why that is because of the carve-out that we talked about earlier that said fantasy sports were skill-based and not chance-based. And we're basically exempt from this UIGEA. What we have to remember, just getting a message from Derek, no problem. What we have to remember that in 2006, we didn't have daily fantasy sports. So the UIGEA exempted traditional fantasy sports. Again, that was these casual leagues with casual plots being played over months and months at a time. But because of this exemption, this spawned daily fantasy sports. So many people, including the authors of the UIGEA, would say that it was never intended, the exemption was never intended for the current daily fantasy sports structure. Had daily fantasy sports as they are today been around in 2006, they would not have been exempted from this law. I don't think anybody could have really foreseen the explosion that happened because of this multi-billion-dollar industry that came out. So there are a couple bullets that have to keep these operators in the boundaries of the UIGEA. So the value of prizes is not determined by the number of participants or the amount of fees paid. So one way that operators have to stay within this law or within the exemption to this law is that all prizes and awards are offered, are known beforehand. So a little example, if the prize pots were determined by how much, how many people were playing, that wouldn't fall into the exemption. So that's similar to an online poker. The winning pot when you're playing online poker is determined by how many people are buying in and what they're wagering. So because the winning pot is decided beforehand, that's one way that it can stay within the exemption. The winning outcome does not reflect, or the winning outcomes do reflect relative knowledge and skill. So it's more, they have to be considered more knowledge and skill based as opposed to more chance based. And the fantasy game results are not based on final scores of any real world games. So we're choosing, right? These contests are decided by the real life performance of multiple players, not the real life performance of one real team. So these are three really important bullets that DraftKings, FanDuel, and these other operators have to stay within the bounds to be still exempt from this law that that outlawed banks being able to transfer money from people's accounts to these online gambling websites. So if there's any more questions, we can talk about that at the end to kind of clear that up. But it's again kind of one of those confusing things. Here's a map. Needs to be updated, but this is from January 1st. So if this map was made today, Ohio would be green. But these green states have already legalized DFS in 2017 or earlier. So if this map was made today, Ohio would be green. These red states introduced legislation efforts that failed in 2016 or 2017. And the gray states have active legislation. And the white states, so these mountain states and also Alaska down here whited out, are where these states are, daily fantasy sports are actually illegal. So the red states, just because legislative efforts failed, it does not mean that daily fantasy sports are necessarily illegal. You can play daily fantasy sports in these states that are red. Just legislative efforts failed to technically make them legal, like Ohio has passed them as skill-based. So you can play daily fantasy sports in these red states. So what will DFS look like in Ohio? Ohio has become the 18th state to legalize fantasy sports. The House approved it in May of 2017, and the Senate approved it in December of 2017. So this is hot off the press. It has been signed into law by the governor. The legislative bill gives the Ohio Casino Control Commission the authority to license, regulate, investigate, and penalize DFS operators with the same respect to skill-based amusement machines, thus making DFS skilled gaming and not gambling. Amanda can jump in anytime if I say something that's not completely correct or if she has anything to add. The license will cost a max of $10,000 per year for potentially up to 3 years. The legislation requires players to be 18 years of age or older. And again, an important point that we talked about earlier, Ohio will not be allowed to have any daily fantasy sports around horse racing, high school, college, or youth sports leagues. After talking with Amanda, it does look like we are going to have what I think is a pretty good amount of consumer protections. Not saying that there shouldn't be more, but I think there are there are some things in here that I did not know about till our conversation. So again, in Ohio, daily fantasy sports is skilled gaming and not gambling. But there are some issues to consider. Age verification. So of course you're playing online, right? So I could really type in any age I want to. So the age verification is something that's still being kind of worked around. If it was found out that the age was not appropriate, the account could be suspended. Looks like we have a question here. Here's our question. How do you think DFS will affect the rate of problem gambling? Well, I think it may, and we are getting to that just in another slide or two. Thank you for the question. Some of these other protections, player designation. So this is something that me and Amanda spoke about. One thing that I thought would be very impactful for problem gamblers, again, was those numbers we were showing about minnows and whales. So really statistical, experienced players, essentially preying on less experienced players. There may be a player designation here in Ohio, so you would know the skill level or the experience level of the people that you were playing. So I think that's something that can be very beneficial to individuals getting involved in daily fantasy sports. There's going to be a question of voluntary exclusion. So similar to the casinos and racinos, someone can voluntarily exclude themselves to being allowed into those venues. So the question is, can someone have some sort of blocker on their computer that says, I know I'm having a problem with this. I need to, I guess, be able to put a barricade or a barrier to me being able to sign in and play these contests. So that's something that still needs to be worked out. Currently, our venues fund prevention and treatment services based on their revenue. So if daily fantasy sports is not considered gambling, they would not have to pay into our prevention and treatment services that come out of gambling revenue. Compulsive behavior warnings. So casino commercials and casino billboards and things like that, the advertisements, they have, things like play responsibly. They have the Ohio Problem Gambling Helpline number on those advertisements, on those billboards. There's a question of, is there going to be a behavioral warning on these websites, on these commercials? Because again, it's not considered gambling. So is there going to be some sort of, play safe? Think of commercials for alcohol, drink responsibly, these things like that. Is there going to be some sort of behavioral warning on these websites and on these advertisements? And if the Ohio Problem Gambling Helpline number is not on this website, what else could there be for resources? And Amanda spoke with me that the National Council on Problem Gambling, they may be able to have a website link or a helpline number on those websites if the Ohio Problem Gambling helpline number cannot be. I think there's some really interesting discussion points here that I'm sure Amanda is working very, very hard on with these operators and regulators, because there's a lot of questions here when it comes to age, player designation, voluntary exclusion, compulsive behavior warnings, resources that are available for someone who thinks they might be having a problem. So there's a lot there that still needs to be worked out.
Okay, so I'll just jump in for a second, Mike. This is
Please.
Amanda Blackford from the Casino Control Commission. A lot of these consumer protections are going to be determined by the rules that the commission has to write. Those rules, we're starting to work on those. March is when the legislation actually goes live. So March is when we'll really start writing out those rules. Those rules have to go through the Common Sense Initiative and the JCAR process and get approved by all those processes before we can adopt them. One of the problems that comes into play when we're trying to write rules for fantasy sports is that websites, the websites that you see are going to be obviously like across the nation. So it's something that is going to be a problem. It's not like we can write rules that, you know, are so Ohio specific. If we try to do that, they're going to get thrown out in the Common Sense Initiative or the JCAR process and not get them through the proper legislative channels. So that's one thing that is a bit restrictive. There may be some things that we would like to do specific to Ohio that we're not going to be able to because of the fact that these websites are so national. Yeah, I think that's it. I think you did a good job of covering a lot of the things that we want to get through the rule process. Sharks and Whales having a special designation so that all individuals can see that they're playing against players who obviously have the upper hand. One thing that we also want to get through is contests only for beginners. So we talked about sharks, whales, minnows, that kind of thing. So it'll be contests that are only for minnows that sharks and whales can't participate in for beginning players.
Great, thank you for those add-ins. Yeah, I think that's very important, and I didn't know about those before our conversation. So I think there's a lot of work there to be done, and you definitely spoke to some of the barriers, but having things like player designation and beginner player contests, if there's a compulsive behavior warning, there are some things that are being done, which is nice. I seem to have, there we go. Briefly, just some other national expansion that may be a future PGNO webinar. We do have this legalization of daily fantasy sports. You may have also heard of credit card use for lottery purchases here in Ohio. So in the past, lottery purchases could only be done through cash transactions, but now credit cards are being accepted. Nationally, Pennsylvania has had a gambling expansion recently with satellite casinos. I spoke to the iLottery earlier, so lottery on your phone, slot machines in truck stops, daily fantasy sports in airports, I believe. So Pennsylvania has had an expansion. And then what I really wanted to touch on was the New Jersey potential repeal of PASPA. So again, PASPA was the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act of '92, which effectively outlawed traditional sports betting. This may be repealed, and if so, that would open up the opportunity for any state to pass legislation on traditional sports betting. And Pennsylvania and many other states have already drawn up legislation for this. I know that a lot of the major sports leagues are expecting a decision in 2018. And just very recently, last week, the NBA came out, the National Basketball Association came out with their kind of idea and plan for if/when sports betting really does become opened up. And one thing that the commissioner even stated was that they're going to try to have kiosks inside basketball arenas for betting on the game that's going on right in front of people. So this is something that we need to be thinking about and kind of not, think about blindly. I think we really need to be aware that these are things that could very well happen. And be prepared for something like that, because that would be a real big game changer. Oh, I thank you. So scope, I did, and this is going to get into one of our questions earlier. If this is going to affect, increase, etc., the rate of problem gambling. All of this is really changing the landscape of gambling, right? And very quickly, from traditional fantasy sports to these daily contests where millions of dollars are changing hands, to the opening up of traditional sports betting. It's really changing and increasing the availability, accessibility, and acceptability of gambling. And one thing that makes me think about is early inundation. So youth today are the first generation to be fully exposed to multiple forms of legal gambling. So whether it's casinos, racinos, fantasy sports. My first fantasy sports league, I had a fantasy football team. So this was a traditional season-long fantasy football team when I was in 7th grade, which I think is like 13 years old. So it's something that youth are doing and youth are very aware of. And I think we need to remember that, youth are growing up not only in this gambling culture, but, with this in this technological age. So young children are able to use computers. So what do I want to say? They understand it, right? They're really good at learning these things and learning them quickly. So it's something that we need to think about with youth. Potential problem gambling. These things are so easily accessible. Again, the speed and intensity. It's something that I can play every single day. There's no pause. The competition is and can be fierce. A lot of the times, it's not just about winning money, but it's about kind of proving that you have this skill and this knowledge. Rewards, there's a lot of rewards and reinforcements. The age verification is something we need to think about. It can be isolating because you can do it so by yourself on your phone, on your laptop. It can be an escape. I think there's a big preoccupation with it, again, that comes from it being daily. It's something that I'm always thinking about. But the complete coverage of it, again, you can go on any ESPN website, you can turn the news on, and you're seeing these fantasy shows that are just revolved around fantasy sports, telling you how to bet, what guys play well, in what weather, in what stadiums. It's a constant just feed of it. Early big win potential. So I could win a significant amount of money for me sheerly based on luck, but I could also win based on some of my knowledge and my skill. And if I win big one of my first times playing, that's going to be something that's going to stay with me. And I think a lot of us know about the risk of an early big win and how it does have an impact on future problem gambling. And then cognitive distortion. So yes, there's some skill. Yes, there's some knowledge involved, but there is chance. And a lot of people fall into some of these distortions where they believe that they have control over the game. They believe that they know more than other people. And if that is true for someone, they may start betting too much, right? And they may bet out of their bounds. But then also, it's really time, right? Problem gambling isn't necessarily about how much you're losing, as opposed to it is the consequences. So missing school, missing work, missing relationships that can come out because I can play so often. Question, do you think we need to put a large emphasis on addressing youth? It is a sticky subject to target because they are not legal yet to gamble, but we know that they do. It's a great question. And that goes to, I'm kind of chuckling, it goes to the black and white of the legislation, right? We should be targeting youth for prevention, for education. So daily fantasy sports are not gambling in this state. Clear and simple, right? They're not gambling. It's considered a skill-based amusement. We do have an age verification. You have to be 18, but it's something that we know youth do get involved in, and youth shouldn't be gambling if they're underage. So that's something we think about a lot at Recovery Resources, because we do a lot of outreach and education with college students and with high school students. So what is the message, right? Is the message abstinence? Don't gamble because you are not of age to. Kind of like you said, your sticky subject, which I agree with. We know they're gambling. So in my professional and personal opinion, we don't educate with abstinence. We really don't. Even when we go into high schools, we mention, listen, you're not of age. There could be many different types of consequences for gambling when you're not of legal age. But we do talk about responsible play and knowing what the limits are, knowing what the consequences are, because we know that they're doing it. So that's typically how we go about our education. But I think, to your point, there should be an emphasis on youth because they're growing up with this. It's the inundation is just it's everywhere.
There was also a question on our NCAA basketball brackets, tourney brackets legal. So to answer this, there are three different kinds of, I'll say, betting. So there's the daily fantasy competitions, which is what we've been talking about here, which to be legal will have to follow all of the rules and legislation that is already in place. There is pooled not-for-profit, which is sort of like what you do with your friends. If you all want to pitch in, $5 and complete a bracket, and who winner takes all, that's obviously, it's legal. You can do it. It's fine. Now, pools for profit are a different story. That's where illegal betting comes into play. If somebody is taking a rake on what's put in, that's when it becomes illegal. So to answer that, there's different ways to answer that, but those are the three main things that we look at.
Yeah, and I think that's a great answer. And I think most people play the not-for-profit. So yeah, in your work, in your school, where you see with your buddies, where you see a lot of people filling out March Madness brackets, the majority of those are probably legal. But like Amanda said, if someone's taking a rake, if someone's taking something off the top, then that's where you get into illegal sports gambling. So some future implications. I think it's becoming very normalized. And when something becomes too normalized, the perception is that there's no risk. And that's kind of the main thing that we think about here, is that because it's skill-based and it's not considered gambling, because you can do it all the time, because it's legal, people have a misconception that there is no risk. And there are risks, right? You can lose a significant amount of money, but then you can get into the other consequences of problem gambling, unemployment, divorce, loss of relationships, depression, the other mental health disorders that are associated, the other substance use disorders that are associated. So the early inundation, we know that with any risky behavior, the earlier someone gets involved, the greater potential for problem severity is later in life. Crossing borders, so many different states have different forms of gambling now that, there's no big walls or whatever. If I want to do a form that isn't legal in my state, I can drive over to Pennsylvania in about an hour and do something that I'm not allowed to do here. The integrity of sport, I think, is something to always think about, trying to minimize that with, amateur and college sports not being offered, but it's something that still is possible. The criminal activity that comes with problem gambling is a potential. And then, of course, just any increase in problem gambling disorders. So one thing I always say is that gambling expansion doesn't necessarily take the non-gambler into gambling, and it doesn't necessarily take the already problem gambler into a deeper or more strong gambling problem. What gambling expansion does is it takes the at-risk gambler potentially then into problem gambling. So this is a gambling expansion, even though we're not, calling it such because it's skilled gaming, but it's something still that's one more available form that people can get involved in. So I think it is, I'm not going to say that, yes, it's going to create more problem gamblers. I wouldn't say that, but we'll use it as an opportunity for more education, for more discussion about this as a risky behavior. So our conclusion, have the conversation when you're talking about these things. Think about what the person doesn't know, what messages are going to stick with them. I always like to debunk myths and promote truths and facts about gambling. This is a public health issue. It affects a large number of people. but it affects all aspects of our health: physical, social, mental, emotional, and it affects all aspects of life. Again, too many people think too often that a problem with gambling is simply a problem with your finances, and that's not true. The consequences are much more than that. Gambling disorder does not discriminate, and any type of gambling can become a problem. So whether it's lottery, sports, fantasy sports, casino, bingo, it's not labeled to any type of gambling. And this is preventable, it's identifiable, and it's treatable. So we can prevent problem gambling, we can identify it, and we can treat it in those that are affected by it. Some quick tips for responsible gambling: treat the money you lose as the cost of your entertainment, treat the winnings as a bonus, plan ahead, set dollar limits and stick to them, set a time limit and stick, be prepared to lose. I think these are some important ones when we're talking about daily fantasy sports. Make it a private rule not to gamble on credit, so don't borrow money to gamble. Create balance in your life, especially daily fantasy sports. This is something that should interfere or substitute with your work, with your time with family and friends, with other worthwhile activities. Avoid chasing lost money. Don't gamble as a way to cope with emotional or physical pain. Know the warning signs. Here's some organizations around, these are just around our state. So, of the Problem Gambling Network of Ohio. Ohio for Responsible Gambling is the group that's the commissions, the regulatory bodies, so the Casino Control Commission, the Lottery Commission, and the Racing Commission, along with the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. There's the Cuyahoga Problem Gambling Coalition that's out of Cleveland, and there's the Problem Gambling Prevention Coalition, which is out of Montgomery County. So there's a lot of bodies in our state that have a lot of great resources for clinicians, for professionals, but also for the community. So get in touch with those for more information. And it looks like that's the end of our time. I hope that was helpful. I hope it wasn't too much. They are big topics with a lot of information, but we have a couple more minutes if there is another question or comment.
Okay, and as we have any additional comments or questions come in, just a reminder that this session has been recorded and will be sent to you along with the continuing education certificate for 1.25 hours, along with the PowerPoint handout. So those resources will be sent out to you later this week. Also would like for you to join us on February 13th. We'll be talking about Problem Gambling Awareness Month, and you can register for that on the GoToWebinar, on the events page of the Problem Gambling Network of Ohio. And were there any additional comments from Mike or Amanda?
I did see there was a question on, since this is web-based, how will you know if a player is participating from a state that has legalized this type of play? In our legislation, there is something, we do require them to use geolocation to tell us, where the person is located and if this is legal for them. And other states that have, made it illegal, like Nevada, have, forced them out using that type of technology.
And we're getting a lot of great jobs and thanks. So yes, please again join me in thanking both Mike Dizzelli with Recovery Resources and Amanda Blackford, the Ohio Casino Control Commission. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day, everyone.
Great. Thank you very much, Derek.
Thank you.